Welcome to the first meeting of the Gonzaga Socratic Club for the 2010-2011 year. We're glad you're here today. The Gonzaga Socratic Club is an organization dedicated to following the slogan of Socrates, to follow the argument wherever it leads, and our particular focus is issues in the Christian worldview. We're following the model set by the Oxford Socratic Club, which was presided over by famous Christian author and apologist C.S. Lewis in the middle of the 20th century at Oxford University. And it's a great model for us to follow, and we've had a lot of fun doing that. This is the beginning of the 6th year of the Socratic Club, with lots of interesting conversations that we've had in the past. Art is often thought of by people in an ordinary level as a kind of adornment to our lives. It's a way to decorate our lives, rather like some of you students beginning the semester decorate your dorm room. It's a bit too spare to have a room with white walls, so you want to buy a poster or two to stick up on the walls. And we think of art in that way, as a kind of adornment, an add-on to our lives. Much popular art, for that reason, is decorative. And I've had a lot of conversations with Erik Schmidt. I constantly come around to the theme of Thomas Kincaid. You might think I was a painter of light, Reg Pat TM, or whatever it puts at the end of his name. You might think I was a fan of his, but no, not really. But that's the way a lot of us think about art, is that art is decorative, art is adornment, art is something that we just add on to our lives. I can quote a sentiment that I've heard more than one person say. When I read a book, / watch a movie, / go to a museum, fill in that list, I want to be entertained. Life is depressing enough as it is. And I think that kind of captures how a lot of us think about art and literature, about aesthetic experience more broadly, that the purpose that it plays in our lives is to add a bright spot to an otherwise potentially dreary and challenging day. Our speaker today has a very different way of thinking about art and the aesthetic experience. And it's certainly true that art can do a great deal more. I'm not denying, by the way, that art can adorn our lives, that art can entertain us. I'm not denying that. But it's also the case that art potentially has a great deal more powerful purpose in human life than entertainment or adornment. The argument that we're going to hear today suggests that art is morally significant. That itself might strike you as kind of strange. I mean, art and ethics seem to be completely unrelated to one another. Ethics, after all, has to do with what we ought to do, with commands and demands that are placed upon us, whereas art, as I've suggested so far, at least in the popular imagination, has significantly to do with entertainment, with adornment, with adding a little bit to our lives. But the view that we're going to hear today is that art can be morally significant in critical part because it's involved in moral development. It is a way that contributes to the deepening process of our understanding ourselves and our place in the world, and yes, including those issues about demands that are placed on us in the ethical sense. Our speaker today is Dr. Erik Schmidt of the Philosophy Department of Gonzaga University. He came to Gonzaga in 2003. His degrees are a bachelor's from Wheaton in Illinois in 1993 and a PhD in philosophy from Syracuse in 2003. So if you would, please welcome Dr. Schmidt to tell us about this relationship.
There's a sense in which what we're going to do today is to follow the argument into the art gallery, and there's a sense also in which I'm wearing two hats today. I've selected my topic partly as appropriate for the Socratic Club, and partly also to kick off the annual theme this year on campus, which is the theme of beauty. And the reading that all freshmen were asked to do over the summer in anticipation of arriving on campus was a picture of Dorian Gray. And so I will be talking about the relationship between ethics and beauty within the visual art world. And Dr. Random from the English department will be talking about the relationship between ethics and beauty within the context of Oscar Wilde. So that provides a little broader introduction as well. So in The Four Loves, C.S. Lewis argues that it is only agape that enables us to love the unlovable. Criminals, enemies, morons, the superior, the sneering. I want to ask whether our experience of a work of art can help us cultivate agape. To answer this question, I will look at the works of two artists that for many years I found difficult to love, Cy Twombly and Richard Tuttle. Anybody, I don't know whether Doug or anybody saw my first talk, but I actually used Cy Twombly as an example of someone that I thought was just the ugliest artist I could imagine. And that was about 5 years ago. Of course, that just prompted me to investigate more, to go back to Twombly. So Cy Twombly and Richard Tuttle. I will explain how I found a source of beauty in their work and how an experience of their beauty strengthens our capacity for agape. Now, before I start, I'd like to make two preliminary points. First, the claim that our experience of art or beauty in certain artworks contributes to moral development is neutral with respect to the moral criticism of artwork. So some of the content of the preface of Dorian Gray, I think, but my claim shouldn't be taken as antagonistic to those claims. And second, my thesis today will not imply that people who lack an experience of art are less morally developed. In short, I'm comfortable recognizing that aesthetically sensitive individuals can be moral scoundrels, that moral saints can have no interest in art, and that morally objectionable works of art might possibly be beautiful. So I'm just not going to be addressing those particular controversial claims. So what kind of love am I going to be talking about? Philosophers usually associate beauty and art with eros, or erotic love, rather than agape, or charity or unconditional love. Now the reason for this is simple. Beautiful works of art, like beautiful people, draw us into their orbit. They involve physical attraction, and we might even say that discovering a connection with a new artist or a new album is a lot like falling in love. Agape, on the other hand, demands choice or will. If we are to love our neighbors as ourselves, as we are commanded in Matthew 22:39 and 1 John 4:20, then it will often take an act of will, since, to be honest, we may find some of our neighbors unattractive. Agape, therefore, requires the will to love people even when we aren't naturally attracted to them. Now, some philosophers use this distinction to divide love into two camps: loves of preference and loves of will. On the one side of that divide, we have instances or forms of love that are motivated by preference, inclination, or attraction. So eros, which is erotic love, storge, which is familial love, and philia, which is friendship, all count as instances of preferential love, since they each involve an outpouring of warmth and tenderness and affection that's spontaneous, natural, or as the Greeks might say, instinctual. As Lysander tells Hermia in A Midsummer's Night's Dream, this sort of love is swift as a shadow, short as any dream, brief as the lightning in the collied night, that in a spleen unfolds both heaven and earth, and ere a man hath power to say, behold. And I like that. It's a lightning flash and something glandular, kind of all at once. Just a fascinating sort of compact statement about this sort of preferential love. Now, on the other side of the divide, we have instances or forms of love that must be willed or chosen. The clearest examples here would be agape, unconditional love for one's neighbor, or xenia, the hospitality of an attentive host. Now, in both cases, we have to choose to be compassionate, warm, or inviting toward people who might be unfamiliar or potentially unattractive. So, two sorts of ethical concerns in the history of philosophy rely heavily on this distinction between preferential love and willed love. So first, some philosophers worry that attraction or preference is passive. Attraction or chemistry isn't, after all, something we can choose. We don't choose when, where, or how powerfully eros might hit us. And when it does hit us, we often have no idea why it hit us. But if this is true, how can love be part of ethics? How can we be responsible for something we can't control? Falling in love seems to be a descriptive fact about us rather than a choice we ought to make. Kant follows this line of thought in his Metaphysics of Morals, and he concludes that we should distinguish between pathological love. Doesn't mean kind of bad, he just means literally a love of pathos or emotion, from practical love, love that's willed. Now, some of you may remember from your ethics classes that Kant thinks that the source of our moral worth lies in our autonomous will. And so practical forms of love, like agape, for Kant, are going to have greater moral worth, while preferential forms of love, like eros, do not. So that's the first reason why people like to distinguish between preferential love and practical love. Seems like the one has much greater ethical significance. That's just better suited for ethical significance than the other. Now, the second concern that is motivated by a distinction between loves of preference and loves of will can be found in Kierkegaard. Now, Kierkegaard worries about the way that loves of preference change over time. I mean, Lysander mentions that in his mention. It's brief as a dream, right? I mean, it's something that's can change. And so Kierkegaard writes, quote, only when it is a duty to love, only when love is eternally secured against every change, eternally free in blessed independence, eternally and happily secured against despair. That's the only love that can, in a sense, be eternal and fixed. Love of will of this type, he argues, is incapable of turning into jealousy or dissolving into boredom. This stability enables willed love to form a part of our identity. It can become a source of eternal value, which is something that the love of preference or inclination can never offer us. So that's a second sort of ethical concern here, is just, seems like the preferential loves are just too fickle to really be suitable for the sorts of ethical projects that Kierkegaard thinks we ought to be engaged in. Now, in this paper, I'm going to argue that preferential and willed love are not separate. I want to find a more Platonic conception of love, you might say. One which assumes the unity of all forms of love. I'm going to suggest that it's impossible to develop any one form of love in isolation from the others. That each form of love is infused and informed by the others, and that they're all connected to sensory experience. And my argument here is going to be, if I'm going to connect agape to art, I've got to have kind of in my background that there's a sensory dimension to agape that Kierkegaard and Kant miss. That's going to be kind of the background question. So let me introduce you to the works I want to defend draw us toward agape. So I've given you actually the photograph of the two artists because the artists themselves and what I think, the kinds of people they are, I think you can kind of see in these two portraits. So here is Cy Twombly. This is a fairly recent photograph of him. In the background, a large installation of panels currently installed in a museum in Zurich, Switzerland. So that's Cy Twombly. Kind of keep him in mind. I think his suspenders, he's jovial, but he's a presence. I mean, he's in the center of the gallery. Photograph of Richard Tuttle walking around in the mountains behind his house in New Mexico. Kind of a classic. I like how the fact he has some stains on his pants. You can't see. I always have stains in my pants, so Richard makes me feel better about myself. But he just, I think, just see him. He's out in the natural world. His face isn't at all commanded. Just kind of keep that in mind. Now, here's their art. This is the art I think draws us toward agape. This is Cy Twombly's, first is Cy Twombly's work. I'm going to show you two works from each of them. I like watching people's faces as they see. Here's the second work. And to keep in mind here, Cy Twombly is a world historical figure, in terms of art. His works are installed at all the great museums. You will see the Philadelphia Museum has an entire room, about this, a little smaller than this room, consisting simply of 8 panels of his, called the 50 Days of Ilium. That I'll show you a little bit later. And this is not, you might say, it just looks like scribbles, but there's at least, he's playing some sort of role. So that's Cy Twombly. If you look perplexed, I hope you are. Here is Richard Tuttle. It is a wire attached to the wall and a thin pencil line next to it. So work number 1. Very different from Cy Twombly, I'd say, right? And here's another one, part of his Octagon series. It's a bit of canvas stretch. a little bit of laughter. It's actually fine. I mean, what you might say, so why I like this line. Why Tuttle and Twombly? It's not just alliteration, assure me. Of all of the artists I could have selected, why them, right? I mean, weren't you expecting the Ghent altarpiece or something, right? Now, I have chosen them because they strike me as paradigmatically difficult artists. Leaving out conceptual and performance artists, who are really, I think, kind of on the fringe, these are two artists that make people mad, or laugh, right? In fact, Richard Tuttle's first retrospective in 1975 at the Whitney Museum in New York City was vandalized, right? So, I mean, people get that upset when they see this sort of work. I don't know exactly if you'd be able to tell whether Cy Twombly's had been vandalized. I'm just saying that right now. I mean, you might say it approved it, I don't know. So, once again, I'm trying not to laugh. I mean, I really do, because these are actually artists that I hope by the end of my talk, right, you're going to say, they've got something to share with us, right? So why these two? Now, I think these two sets of works are perfect for exploring my thesis, because I want to find cases where our attraction to an artwork takes the form of aesthetic agape, loving the unlovable. So, poor Richard Tuttle's work, I'm calling it here unlovable. Now, what do I mean when I say these works are unlovable? I mean something very specific. For it's important to recognize that the statement, we are called to love the unlovable, which I remember my Sunday school teacher always telling me, always struck me as very odd, right? Because it contains a practical contradiction, right? The category of the unlovable is at odds with the call to love. After all, and I remember asking this to my Sunday school teacher, if I consider someone to count as unlovable, isn't that a poor first step to coming to love them? Right? So it's kind of a puzzle to me. So what do I mean when I say these are unlovable? What I mean is something very specific. What I mean is that these works are unlovable, and I've selected them because they reveal a careful effort on the part of both artists to strip away the elements of painting and sculpture that typically attract us. They've been divested of sources of usual or typical aesthetic interest. Now, Tuttle does this through ruthless simplification. Just keep taking it away, taking it away. Anything that might be a source of attraction, just remove it, right? Cy Twombly does it through very carefully coordinated rejection. So it's not strictly true these works are unlovable, it's just simply that the usual sources of pleasure have been carefully removed. So to summarize here, I've got two challenges today. First, I need to explain how we can find beauty in these works, even though they lack those sources of aesthetic attraction. And second, I need to explain how experiencing these works might take the form of an aesthetic agape, and how that aesthetic agape can play a formative role in our capacity for agape in general. It's kind of two projects. Hopefully. So is everyone clear on kind of two projects? So kind of the two puzzles, right? So hopefully I've given myself a hard enough case for today. Right? Now, while approaching any work of art as a philosopher, I want to share you my method. I mean, I'm the person in our department who's responsible for teaching the philosophy of the visual arts. I'll just give you, this is my approach to art as a philosopher, whether it's Shakespeare or the visual arts. I always start with the work. I always treat the work as the primary text. I allow the work to show me how I should see it. I spend time with it, wrestle with it, until I pick up a thread where I can grasp how things come together. Only then do I turn to secondary resources, things like interviews, art historians, art critics, or other sorts of scholars. And I ask myself, does my response fit with the intentions stated by the artist? Have people I respect come to a similar approach? Finally, I turn to my philosophy. What can the work show or teach me? Is the artist grappling with a set of issues or concerns raised by any philosophers I might know? How can I connect the work with my broader concerns as a human? I'll then end by returning to the work as though the work is itself a visual exploration of that philosophy. I mean, my constant theme is artists are often philosophers. They're not decorative, they can be decorative, but in these cases, they are themselves engaged in a task that's very similar to, I think, philosophical reflection. Different in important ways, but similar in structure. So let's begin with Cy Twombly's work. So people can see that pretty well. I know you see the details right. So let's start with Cy Twombly's work. Graffiti, I think, comes to mind, or a child's scribble. Although on careful inspection, it looks too deliberate for that. I mean, it's clear he carefully avoids color coordination, and he carefully avoids gesture or figures, and even avoids composition. As Cy Twombly himself puts it, my line is childlike, but not childish. It's difficult to fake. You get that quality. To get that quality, you need to project yourself into a child's line. It has to be felt. Sort of a quote that he gives us in one of his interviews. So another clue, you might say. I suppose then that his paintings are careful in this sense, because they don't look careful to me at all on first inspection, right? So you have to say, where's the care? So I suppose his paintings are careful in this sense. Think of any traditional category that we look to evaluate in art. Twombly has painted in a way that carefully excludes it. Now, to accomplish that as a painter may be more difficult than we think. Twombly's telling us his works are harder to imitate than you would think. So I'll take his word for it. That might be a difficult thing to do, actually, to exclude any source of aesthetic value. Take him as for it, right? But even granting that, the resemblance to a child's scribble or to graffiti is unmistakable. I mean, in fact, I think this is closer to the sort of graffiti you find in a men's room than anything done by Jean-Michel Basquiat, who's a famous high art graffiti artist. And I think this provides us with our first clue about Twombly's work. For the thing I notice about Twombly is his incredible presence in a museum. And here, you've got to realize, seeing something in reproduction, everyone always tells you this, it's like an album versus a concert. It's different, right? You see Twombly's work in a museum, it has a power to it. I mean, it's not, these just look like scribbles on a piece of paper. You're looking at sizable canvases. They do have a genuine power to them. And I think the thing I noticed, and I've gone back time and time again whenever I see a Twombly, in the intervening years since my last paper, to just spend time, just to kind of encounter them. And the thing that I notice is that they have this incredible presence in the museum. Often his works, I also started to notice, often his works are based on heroic Greek myths. And I'm thinking here, for example, of his Philadelphia, which I go back year after year to a conference in Philadelphia, so I've been able to spend a good 20, 30 minutes each time I go to Philadelphia in this room with these panels. And it's called 50 Days at Ilium, Heroes of the Acheon. And this is the first of the panels. There you get Priam, Hector, some of the main characters. I'll let that soak in. And you got Achilles' shield. Right? We'll kind of leave it on Achilles' shield for right now. Standing in front of these huge canvases, you can't help but escape the experience that they are the work of a concrete, singular individual. Now, when his paintings first appeared, this impression would have been great. Twombly rose to fame in the 1960s after returning to the U.S. from Italy for his first major show at the Castelli Gallery in New York City. The very first painting I showed you was from the Castelli Gallery exhibit. Now, the thing to keep in mind historically about the 60s is that in the 1960s art world, there was a form of aesthetic correctness that you might say was the political correctness of the decade. Critics like Clement Greenberg had a ton of influence, a huge amount of influence. And materials in the 60s were expected to be industrial, the forms and colors were expected to be muted, and the forms were supposed to be minimal and severe. Now, into that world, you get Twombly, Warhol, Johns, Rauschenberg, a number of other people who are younger artists in the midst of this sort of aesthetic correctness of the age when you're supposed to be doing really, really muted work. So I think against that history, and Twombly comes in making words like this, with allusions to Greek myths and literature. Now, he does insist that 50 Days of Ilium is not about Homer, but about the poetry of Alexander Pope. It's possible, maybe, I know you do poetry, you can help us with this. I don't know how I would distinguish, but nonetheless, maybe you can help us with what he's after. I don't know, it's a possible resource. It's not pressure, Dr. Ray. I'm just posing that, right? So, all these huge references to erudite ancient Greek myths and paintings that just look like, just this intense line, right? So that's what's coming into this world of very severe, reserved art. So seen in that light, it's easy to see why his paintings caused a stir. There's a kind of primitive joy in simply making a mark on the canvas. There's very little joy to a Frank Stella piece. I mean, it's just very muted. There's a kind of a joy here that you just don't get out of those pieces. So let's start there, right? I want to say it seems to me to be a kind of painting, you might say, right? Combine a primitive joy of his line with his tendency to revel in erudite illusions, that you get the idea that he was just this huge presence in the 60s. So Twombly's paintings seem to draw us in, to summarize here, seem to draw us in for the way they provide us with the presence of a concrete, singular individual. They lack any recognizable style. They make no contribution to various discussions about art theory or anything else that was going on in the art world at this time. They aren't reflexive. A lot of art was about art. I mean, it's artists exploring the nature of art. It's not even reflexive. It's not clear this is about art in any sense. They have a kind of existence or presence that gestures at nothing. They are art that brings us back to the most primitive urge that motivates anyone to paint. They revel in the pure act of making a mark. They are, I'm tempted to say, the artistic equivalent of King Lear on the Heath. They are a boar fair. They're a bare-forked animal. Twombly, you might say, is setting before us a naked line, stripped of any resource of interest to us in terms of beauty or art theory. They're visceral and primitive. They're quixotic, utterly imaginary, and completely impractical. They resist theorizing, and yet they're utterly human. They pull us back to the kind of drawing of which each of us is capable. So what I'm suggesting is that what draws us, or might draw us to Twombly's paintings, if we're drawn at all, may well be their unabashed essentialism. It's their identity rather than the quality that pulls us in. So the association with graffiti, I think, makes a great deal of sense on this level, since the urge to write graffiti is often the urge to leave a mark or a trace that stands in for your singular presence. To leave a mark that registers the fact I was here. So I think the paintings tap into the urge to inscribe your name on a prison wall or in the stall of a men's bathroom of various buildings that oppress us with the anonymity of a prison, right? School restrooms, bus terminals, airports. The places where we have the greatest sort of impulse to just leave our mark. There's an impulse to be present through a crude mark or gesture. So the association with the child's scribble also makes a great deal of sense on this level, since the scribble posted to the refrigerator is valued not for its choice of colors or for its aesthetic merits, but rather because it's the mark of a single individual, one's child. Now this may not convince you to love Twombly's works, I'm aware of that, right? Loving art is never an obligation. But I hope I've gone some way toward at least identifying why someone might be pulled toward these works, or why someone might find them powerful. So what's the connection to agape? I want to suggest that the attraction to identity that we can experience with Twombly's work might be the first step toward agape. It is the experience of encountering a concrete individual. It pulls us out of our tendency towards solipsism, which is agape's opposite. Christ tells us to love others as we love ourselves. To open ourselves to the power of Twombly's work is to open ourselves to the experience of the presence of another individual. It pulls us toward the recognition that other people are no less real than ourselves. It cultivates our amazement over the mere presence of another singular human being, even where that being has very little or nothing to contribute to our lives. Parents often say that their children have taught them a great deal about unconditional love. I've always thought that what they were talking about was the sacrifices a child demands of them. I'm not a parent, but looking at Twombly's work has led me to think I've underestimated the way a parent learns something by simply holding a newborn child and being confronted with and pulled toward that child as a unique individual. After all, a child has little to contribute to our lives at birth other than simply being present. In a similar way, I think putting a child's artwork on the refrigerator refers us back to that initial encounter with our child's birth. As in Twombly's work, its power lies in its identity rather than its quality as a work of art. We might even notice here that identity plays a similar role in malice, agape's ugly twin. I'm reminded here naturally, you'll detect a theme, of Iago. Notice that Shakespeare can tell an entirely plausible story about Iago, while never offering us a clear motivation. The only thing he has to offer us is the identity of the man he wants to destroy. That's enough for creating the play and making it intelligible. So in some way, I want to argue agape works in the same way as malice. It starts with our response to a person's identity, and it need not rely on any set of qualities. Now, to draw on the history of philosophy, I'm suggesting here that Twombly's paintings push us toward what the Stoics called oikiosis. The Stoics, as you may know, were famously self-reliant. But the self on which the Stoics relied was not singular but communal, or cosmopolitan. They held that each of us is born attached to himself, and that we experience the original self-attachment through bodies and appetite. But as we mature through the fellowship of reason, the Stoics thought we become attached to an ever-increasing number of people. They took Aristotle's basic idea that friendship is self-love, directed toward other people, and developed it into a concept of a relational self that's connected ultimately to all other humans, the cosmopolitan self. I want to propose that our experience of Twombly, or minimally my experience of Twombly, pushes us closer to the Stoic commitment to oikiosis by providing us with a powerful sensory experience of individual identity. This leads us to experience agape not as a sacrifice, but as a matter of sensory affection. After encountering Twombly's massive canvases, our vision is changed. We see the beauty of each person's singular identity, and that beauty pulls them into the circle of our affection, which is a basic move toward oikiosis, or agape. So that's my account of Cy Twombly. So let's turn to Richard Tuttle. There's a close-up of Richard Tuttle in case you can see from far away. Now let's turn to Richard Tuttle. Walking into a Tuttle exhibit requires that you recalibrate your eyes. At the recent retrospective in Chicago, my wife and I only noticed several works in the hall and entryway on our way out. They were large shapes cut out of very thin white paper that were then laminated to the walls. It shows up in the catalog here. I don't even really put it, it wouldn't scan so well. It's there, white on white, you know. It's actually, I think, a beautiful catalog in the sense. I was really interested in how they were going to portray that in the catalog, and it's just a slight difference in gloss you kind of get. Okay, so but these works we just zipped right by them. We're like, Tuttle, let's go, right? You know, and walked right by him. But what's fascinating was on the way back, we then now I've lost it, please. On the way back, they really captured us, and I think a lot of it was just our eyes. Everything had been recalibrated about our experience after going through the retrospective. We came back, and they were fascinating in a way I don't think they could have been at the start. So that's kind of the start. Some of Richard's works, or some of Tuttle's works, are so subtle that you can easily miss them. But the variations among the works are fascinating, especially after you recalibrate your attention. A second thing you notice is that he uses all of the space in the gallery. Some items are placed along the bottom of the wall, and other pieces reach out toward the ceiling. I'll give you the document here. As you can see, this is one of the rooms. So you walk into this fairly large room, and all the pieces are little, like 6-inch little pieces on the floor right next to the wall. So you walk into pretty much an empty room. All the pieces are down low. You walk in, and of course you're thinking, must be important, right? I mean, it's not an accident. They didn't run out of nails. There has to be some reason why these things are on the floor, right? So a second thing you notice is he uses all the gallery. Some items are placed along the bottom wall, and other pieces you gradually start noticing are, there are these little subtle pieces up toward the ceiling. Now, while Twombly's work, we saw before, provides a powerful sense of the artist's presence, Tuttle's work strikes me as closer to a series of traces, a record of an event that happened long ago. The artist is gone. There wasn't an artist. You really had the sense that you're almost walking through a strange post-apocalyptic landscape in which there are just fragments of a civilization that once existed. It's this really kind of eerie. And so it's hard, once again, as I say, the concert to album comparison, it's hard to talk in some ways clearly about the effect of walking through these rooms has on you. And it was interesting to watch people kind of bored at the beginning, slowing down, in a sense, as they went through. And so walking through a Tuttle exhibit is like looking for fossils in a pile of shale. That was kind of my first note to myself. It just seemed like I was walking around in the shale piles that you can go to look for the trilobites out here. Once your eyes adjust, fragments and shapes emerge, and you can't resist this urge to put the shapes together. Here is one example of, I gotta go back to the PC. Here's an example. Actually, I don't want to do that one yet. Okay, so here's an example. In this example, he takes a wire fastened loosely at both ends. So imagine a loose wire fastened at both ends. Pulls down on the center, actually it was horizontal, pulls down on the center of the wire to form an angle, and then releases the wire to allow it to spring back out away from the wall. He then traces the shadow cast by the current light on the wall with a pencil. So when you approach the work, you have three elements. You have the wire, the trace of the original shadow, and the current shadow on this wall. Kind of three very spare elements. There's a quiet beauty to the work because it holds an ever-changing record of time. It's effectively a sundial, but oriented not toward the sun, but toward the human gesture of pulling a wire taut. So as we look around the gallery, and kind of imagine yourself in this gallery, right, we see these quiet artworks that are more like faint traces than objects. They're close to tree rings or ripples in sandstone or fossils, but they have a distinct human presence since they do not record an event, but an action. A clear example here was a work that I found strangely poignant. Odd effect that Twombly can have on you. This was one of the most affecting works of art I think I've seen in an art museum in a long time. And this is actually, I couldn't find the image. The one I saw on the wall was a short 3 or 4 inch cord that had simply been tied into a slight knot, like a really loose kind of overhand loop, and then pinned to the wall. So I couldn't find that one, so here's another one that's kind of frayed the edges. You might say, a single overhand knot is Baroque. Right? He realized that that's too much, right? I should just fray the ends a little bit, right? Subtlety here is his key, right? In the midst of a large gallery, on one wall, all alone, and this wall was huge. I mean, he takes up immense amounts of space for his exhibits. Huge wall, small little cord. In the midst of a large gallery on one wall, all alone was a short piece of cotton cord that had been looped into a loose overhand knot and pinned to the wall. Looking at the rope, it struck me that this shape revealed a combination of forces that was uniquely human. It struck me that it would have made a better example than Paley's watch as an object requiring a special kind of causation to explain its origin. That's kind of my next sort of thought to myself. Compare this to the watch. It was clear that it could only be tied by a human hand, given the size. And so this small cord pinned to a long white gallery wall was nothing more than the trace or the record, not of an event, but of a human act, a will. And staring at that small cord, I could see perhaps the simplest and clearest trace or fossil record of the most complex type of event in the universe, an act governed not by natural forces, but by a human will. If through Twombly's work, the first artist, we engage the identity of a singular individual, with Tuttle, we're pulled into a powerful experience of the miracle of human autonomy, the surprisingly human dimension of the slightest gesture. My response here is similar to the reflection of others. Marcia Tucker, who curated the 1975 Whitney exhibit, observed, the one that was vandalized, observed Tuttle installing the exhibit. He spends a lot of time in these spaces. And she reports, Tuttle readies himself as a dancer would for the activity of making the work present to himself and to us. That so much of Tuttle's work as a result of bodily activity is partly caused by the fact that physical activity is the most direct and common means we have of translating interior states into external expression. I mean, that, as a philosopher, I would say, is simply an expression of autonomous will. The connection our experience of Tuttle's work holds to agape, I think, complements the Stoic notion of oikeiosis. Instead of beauty Instead of the beauty of encountering a concrete, singular individual, we encounter the miracle of human autonomy, our capacity to will and act. My suggestion here is similar to the view that the Enlightenment philosopher Immanuel Kant defended. Kant argued that our sense of dignity as humans lies in our will, our capacity for autonomous action. He thought our capacity to act generates a duty to respect other people in the sense that we must act in ways that preserve and promote other people's autonomy. Now, he offers a long argument for why that's the case. Those of you who have taken 301 may be familiar with that argument. Those of you who have not, you will encounter it. But after that argument, he goes on to argue that we have an indirect duty to cultivate sympathy toward others. Because given human psychology, he thinks sympathy is one effective route to the respect for fellow humans that duty or respect for autonomy requires of us. In this way, Kant values sympathy as a vehicle toward respect. That's kind of the Kantian notion of moral development. He says, if you avoid people who are suffering, the poor, the sick, the downtrodden, you're actually not satisfying your duty to respect people because you're failing to cultivate the sympathies that will lead you to respect their autonomy. I want to suggest today that our experience of Tuttle's work leads to a slightly different developmental path. In this case, our experience of an object is the experience of the autonomy of a person who's no longer present in the room. Our encounter with the object, that's why I kind of love the fact that he's just out in the desert somewhere, right? That's just kind of the perfect counterpart in a catalog, where Twombly's just stand right there in the middle in his suspenders. Very different sorts of art. I want to suggest that our experience of Tuttle's artwork leads to a slightly different developmental path, right? Our encounter with the object pulls us toward or attracts us through sensory experience of what would otherwise be nothing more than a conception, something you might find in a textbook. What we learn through Tuttle's work, therefore, is not that human love points us toward respect, which was Kant's observation, but rather that we can find the autonomy which serves as the grounding for that respect beautiful in its own right, and we can be pulled toward that autonomy. Tuttle's work, in other words, offers us a powerful sensory experience of autonomy. And walking away from the Tuttle exhibit in Chicago, it was hard to look at people in the same way. Each person I saw on the street outside struck me as miraculous as the hand whose gesture tied that short piece of cord into a gentle knot. It was a really So, my conclusion. At the start of my paper, I presented myself with two challenges. First, I hope to explain how we might come to find beauty in artworks that are difficult to love because of the way they eliminate typical sources of aesthetic interest. Second, I hope to explain how our experience of that beauty might contribute to our capacity for unconditional love. Now, I've argued that both sets of works pull us toward agape through sensory experience because they alter the way we encounter the world. Twombly's work draws us toward the beauty of the presence of a single individual, which can be a source of what the Stoics called oikeiosis, or the gradual unfolding of our circle of concern and attention for other beings. Tuttle's work pulls us toward the beauty of human autonomy. And in both cases, the beauty of the art does not lie in some set of aesthetic values located on the canvases themselves, but rather in the carefully orchestrated experience we have of the artwork which has eliminated most of the elements that usually draw us to love a work of art. And so I conclude that works of art can be beautiful for what they enable us to access through sensory experience. They present a type of beauty that draws us out into the world and leaves us more prepared to love it. And so it would seem that some of the highest and noblest things in our world, including agape, are not severed from our senses.
It is the custom and tradition at the Socratic Club to have a respondent to help promote our discussion and conversation. Our response today, although both of the participants have told me it's more a conversation or continuing a conversation than an academic paper and refutation. Our response today, though, will be from Professor Ingrid Ranum from the English department here at Gonzaga University. Professor Ranum has her BA from Luther College in 1989 and finished her PhD at WSU in 2004 before she came here in 2005. So welcome, Professor Ranum.
Yes, I do want to make a couple of quick preliminary statements. The first is thank you for inviting me to participate in this. Thanks, Eric, and thank all of you for showing up on Friday afternoon. That's impressive. And at the same time, I'd like to also make a small disclaimer. Aside from being a little out of my element in the philosophy Socratic club, I'm also not a Wilde scholar. So I'm jumping into this sort of sideways. I am a Victorianist, but I do most of my work on the kinds of writers that Wilde was reacting against. So I see him from a different angle. He is nevertheless fascinating as a human being and as an artist, and so I'm pleased to get the chance to talk about him a little bit. First of all, how many of you actually read Dorian Gray? A good few. Good. Okay. I will be talking about Dorian Gray a bit. This is not going to be specifically directly a reading of Dorian Gray. It's going to be more a reading of Oscar Wilde, actually. So I'll go ahead and jump into it. As a rough outline, what I'm going to be talking about first is the Victorian context. And this is going to be brief. I'm going to handle everything quickly. So a reductive view of the Victorian context and Wilde's biography, how he fits into that, how that develops into his aesthetic theory, and then a little bit on his literary art. So I'll jump off from there. The Victorian period, I say my representation of it was going to be reductive, but Wilde's view of it was reductive as well. So you're getting the mini version of Victorian England. It was heterogeneous, and all of the ideas that we have about Victorians, all of the baggage that's loaded onto that term, is partly earned, but was also loaded onto the Victorians by the Victorians themselves. Just about every criticism you can think of the Victorians, other Victorians said. So, Wilde's view, and the view that was rising in the sort of avant-garde of the 1890s, the fin de siècle crowd, was not divorced from fact, but it did see the larger Victorian culture as peculiarly moralistic and didactic, and that the literature came to serve other forces, right? For instance, the poet Matthew Arnold disavowed one of his poems, a really good poem, and left it out of his collected works because, however beautiful, it was morbid and didn't give it gave depictions of suffering that didn't have a lesson to it, right? It was unrelieved, and so he left it out of his own collected works. Poets like Elizabeth Barrett Browning were unabashedly political. Whenever I'm teaching a Victorian class, I can use her to illustrate any social issue that's going on. She addressed slavery, child labor, the Italian wars, the woman question, whatever it is, she was in the middle of it. In a very overtly political way. Tennyson used his laureateship to valorize war and empire. Realist and then naturalist novels and drama brought literature away from the romantic idylls and upper-class leisured characters, putting readers instead into squalid factory towns and unromanticized heathland hovels and petty middle-class relationships. Great attention was paid to the possible moral impact of art, for good or ill. To some, notably Walter Pater, who's viewed as the father of 19th century aestheticism, the prevailing views of art and aesthetic criticism seem to have gotten away from the elements that they found irreducible in art, beauty. So this is the culture into which Wilde found himself emerging. At least this is the way that he saw it. He was notably always an outsider and an insider. He made himself the center of any milieu that he was in, but he was always also sort of an outsider. He was Anglo-Irish, and so even anywhere in England, he was a bit of an outsider. But he came to Oxford on a scholarship where he read and then later met Pater. Pater was a huge influence on his aesthetic and intellectual life, and he ended up a very strong literary, took a first-class degree at Oxford in literary arts. And he also had a strong influence from his family. His father was a surgeon, I believe, but his mother was a poet of sorts, and also a first-class eccentric. And there are reports of her showing up at parties in outlandish get-ups and wearing 3 levels of skirts and showing them all to everybody, all the different clothes that she's wearing over the top of other clothes. She said that her housekeeper might steal them if she left them out. She'd make up vast stories. She was, I'm sure, really entertaining. And this influenced him too, this sense that you could make up not just your art, but yourself in a way. Put yourself in a space and make yourself the center of it. So the result is a young scholar who's not yet a literary artist, but who adopts an artistic performative view of life. I think you could take him as a prototype for somebody like David Bowie or Lady Gaga. He's the text for figures like that. So he invented himself as flamboyantly witty, flamboyantly dressed. He was famous at Oxford, while he was a student, for the decoration of his living quarters. Basically, his dorm room was peacock feathers, sunflowers, and bright blue china. And he complained later that he was having trouble living up to his china. He recognized that he was making a persona for himself that was broad. He also reportedly would wear sunflowers as boutonnieres. He later began to have his clothing made not by a tailor, but by a costumer who could reproduce the effect that he wanted to make with his own clothing, and is rumored to have walked lobsters around the streets of Oxford on a leash. So you get some sense of who the guy was, and this was before he was ever famous for anything else. He was famous for being Oscar Wilde, which also probably has parallels in our culture. So when he went to London upon graduation, he already had a bit of a name. And before he published any of his poetry or criticism or drama or anything, he was already being caricatured in the press. There would be pictures that were caricatures of him as a type of the aesthetic. So, for all that befell him later, and I'm sure many of you know something about how his life went, and that's not insignificant to our topic today. I'm not going to trace that out right now, but his early career is just as significant as a social experiment, and it also exists as a kind of aesthetic artifact that he consciously made of himself. So, Wilde's aesthetic theory. See, we're on to part 3 already. We're moving along. He comes to be seen as the poster boy, eventually, of aestheticism, and of a parallel but separate movement called decadence. So the aestheticism was built on Pater's ideas and on the French aestheticism that had as its slogan art pour l'art, which we translate as art for art's sake. He comes to be the living embodiment of that around London. And his early criticism shows Pater's influence, but Wilde was always more provocative in the way that he stated it. He was looking for the confrontation. So in a famous essay that he writes actually as a dialogue between a couple of characters that he invents, an essay called The Decay of Lying, he makes the claim, or one of his characters makes the claim, that the final revelation is that lying, the telling of beautiful, untrue things, is the proper aim of art. Okay, that's one of his bits. He also says, in the preface to Dorian Gray, there is no such thing as a moral or an immoral book. Books are well written or badly written. That is all. You can see how these butt up against his perception of Victorian morals. The other movement that he comes to represent is decadence. The decadent movement placed just as much emphasis on beauty, but was almost obsessively focused also on the decay in society. So, when it looked at the decay in society, it looked at it, though, without the didactic or utilitarian motives of mid-Victorian reformist art, or the grubby unloveliness of naturalism. Literary critic Lisa Rudensky describes the poetry of the decadent movement this way. Obsessed with decline and decay, the speakers of these poems cannot muster the energy to resist the decline they so insistently register. She goes on to describe the poems as chronicles and lyrics of sex and drugs and rock and roll, as it were, but takes pains to point out the obsessive craftsmanship that the poets employed in the attempt to capture or produce beauty. Sordid the seams may be, Rudensky allows, but never sloppily so. The decadent poet beautifies the deformed, but ever so precisely. To that end, I want to, we're going to do wild poetry today, because I like the poetry. So just a little bit, I promise. You'll have to indulge me. This is,
It's not PC.
there we go. Hopefully. Can we see this? No?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so this is the first couple of stanzas of a poem with a French title, Impression du matin. The Thames Nocturne, I'll read it out loud when we do it. The Thames Nocturne of blue and gold changed to a harmony in gray. A barge with ochre-colored hay dropped from the wharf, and chill and cold the yellow fog came creeping down the bridges till the house's walls seemed changed to shadows, and St. Paul's loomed like a bubble o'er the town. Beginning of this poem is all painting a picture of morning breaking on London. The opening lines are synesthetic, by which I mean they introduce senses in the wrong context, right? So what we see is described as sound. So you have a nocturne of color. You have the nocturne and the harmony. And then we have the ochre-colored hay dropped from the wharf, the chill and cold, the yellow fog creeping down, there's a personification there. It reminds me very much of, anachronistically, of a camera shot going through the morning as the town wakes up. And if we could just get the next stanza there, that would be great. He goes on. Then suddenly arose the clang of waking life. The streets were stirred with country wagons. That's his spelling, not mine. And a bird flew to the glistening roofs and sang. It's really quite lovely. Very simplistic in form. The whole thing comes out to sort of a 16-line ditty. The rhymes are very easy with some enjambment. Comes along very nicely. But if we can get the last bit. But one pale woman all alone, the daylight kissing her long hair, loitered beneath the gas lamp's flare with lips of flame and heart of stone. This is the decadent ideal. He shows us this person who is likely a prostitute, almost certainly a fallen woman, does not romanticize who she is, includes her in the landscape, makes sure that she's not excluded on the basis of who she is, but does not moralize either. There's the fallen woman in Victorian literature, horrible things happen to, right? Once you make that decision, you end up dead by the end of the novel, almost certainly. Here we see her, and in an odd way, we see her more solidly than anything else. St. Paul's Cathedral is a vaporous bubble in this poem. She's stone. There's something permanent and individual about her. Thanks. That's what I was going to do with that. Okay, so what does any of this have to do with Dorian Gray? And I promise I'll be quick. And I'm not going to undo the whole text either. But I'm interested in the way that Dorian Gray, the novel, and Dorian Gray, the character, seem obsessed with intersections of beauty, art, and the self. There are a lot of ways to mine that topic, but I'm most interested today in not Dorian himself, but in Sybil Vane, the early love interest, the actress, and what she shows us both about her view of art and about him. So, she's not even herself to Dorian. I'm going to read just a little bit out of the text. When he's trying to explain his deep infatuation, his love, for the first time, he tells Henry, I can't help going to see Sybil play. Even if it was only for a single act, I get hungry for her presence, and when I think of the wonderful soul that is hidden away in that little ivory body, I am filled with awe. You can dine with me tonight, Dorian, can't you? He shook his head. Tonight she is Imogen, he answered, and tomorrow night she will be Juliet. Henry asks, when is she Sybil Vane? Never. He is entirely in love with her in the personas that she creates. His friend Henry says, I congratulate you. This is lovely. You've managed to fall in love with the woman who is never the woman who is only ever created as the romantic interest in a Shakespeare play. That's her entire persona to him. Unfortunately, for our anti-hero, the fact of his love of her brings her out of character, makes it impossible for her to not be herself. And when he takes his friends to go see her act again after proposing marriage, he looks at her and she is horrible. She can't be, he's brought a whole audience, and she cannot be what she has been to him, which is Juliet. And she comes and tries to explain to him afterwards and says, Dorian, before I knew you, acting was one reality of my life. It was only in the theater that I lived. I thought that it was all true. I was Rosalind one night. I was, she says, right? Not I pretended to be. I was Rosalind one night and Portia the other. The joy of Beatrice was my joy, and the sorrows of Cordelia were mine also. I believed in everything. The common people who acted with me seemed to me to be godlike. I knew nothing but shadows, and I thought them real. You came, oh my beautiful love, and you freed my soul from prison. You taught me what reality really is. This is horrifying to him, right? And he ends up ditching her, cutting off the engagement, telling her he can never see her again, because she has descended into reality, right? And I think as readers, we look at this and we are meant to see him as misguided. We are drawn to see him as misguided, her as abandoning art and walking into life and being herself instead of a string of related Shakespeare characters. But it's not only in his rejection that this robs something from her. When she explains it, she says, the people that I was with were godlike. She goes on a bit later. Tonight, for the first time, I became conscious that the Romeo was hideous and old and painted, and that the moonlight in the orchard was false, and the scenery was vulgar, and the words I had to speak were unreal, were not my words, were not what I wanted to say. You had brought me something higher, something of which all art is but a reflection. You had made me understand what love really is. Now, when Sybil is performing, taking art as her reality, she is not only more attractive to Dorian, she also has a rich life. She sees beauty around her. The downscale theater, the miscast actors, the false language she spouts are all truly beautiful to her when she's Rosalind or Ophelia. When she rejects her own production of art, all of these surrounding elements also stop being art, therefore also beautiful. They descend from art to reality as she imagines herself ascending from art to a higher life. This ends up being, I'm not giving anything away for those of you who have yet to read the novel, you should dip into it. This ends up being the end for her in the novel in more than one way. She is through by page 87. Less than halfway through, the grand love of his life is over. As she leaves art, she leaves him. Notably, this is our character. I'm sure this is not giving anything away either. Who she leaves is the man who has chosen to be art. The man who has made a Faustian deal to have himself remain beautiful while his painting changes. So when she rejects her own art, she rejects an art that he has already chosen to live in. I will leave it there, which should give you something to do, and we can dive into more conversation. That's not really a debate.
So feel free to ask questions.
Yes.
Just a quick question of you guys. It would be possible for you to kind of summarize how exactly you believe that all of the four loves are synthesized together and each one is formed.
I mean, I hinted in that direction, obviously, at the beginning of the paper. The paper itself is not a full defense of that view. I wanted to identify that my approach to agape, in terms of my own commitments, is more Platonic than Kantian or Enlightenment in that sense. If there's any argument within my paper itself that suggests it, I think it has to do with, if I'm right, that certain sensory experiences can actually either be experiences of the source of a kind of agape, even a Kantian autonomy, let's say, or if, in terms of our development, sensory experiences can pull us toward and attract us toward agape, then I feel like I feel like I've made some argument that they're all tied together through the senses. And that we can't divorce any of them from the senses, where Kierkegaard and Kant, I think, would want to. So it's not a full-bodied argument, but I think it's a suggestion. And obviously, I tantalizingly ended with that sort of suggestion. You might say it's a point for further work. I don't know, is that satisfied? Or do you have commitments of your own? Or?
I kind of wonder exactly in what way, because you look at the picture of what I would say the coat hanger, which is what it looked like.
Yeah, the wire, yeah.
Yeah, the wire. You look at it at the beginning, and I found it almost revolting and a worthless thing. Like, how much does this guy get paid? Running through my mind. And I was wondering, would you say then that the way...
But were you revolted at the idea he was getting paid for it, or were you revolted by a wire?
Probably the first one more.
Right. I mean, I notice I've left out any of the claims about art markets here. Obviously, art markets are crazy. I mean, they just are. But I was just curious. Okay, so
more importantly, I was wondering, would you say that kind of the way that the physicality informs agape in this sense is that while at first we're, in a sense, revolted or unpleased, it calls us deeper into it to start wondering, okay, everyone is saying this is art, why is it?
that's right. I think that's right. Now, in Twombly's case, or excuse me, in Tuttle's case, I don't know that he's asking. There are many artists who simply want to confront us with the question, what are the boundaries of art? Almost philosophically offering us counterexamples. I mean, somebody comes along and says, well, it has to be an item. There was an artist who said, that was my work of art. I mean, it really was an intention. People, I would put Twombly in that group of conceptual artists in that sense. So I don't know that Twombly, at least in my experience, invites me to ask the question, what are the boundaries of art? Or what are the conditions by which something qualifies as art? I think it's more, he invites us to engage very simple objects against a background practice of engaging works of art. And I think he believes that the ways in which he selected things will provide us with a kind of an encounter of sorts. I mean, so it's not so much the boundary of art with Tunnel, but that's what the sensory element is. And that's why I think there's a way in which you can talk about autonomy as a conception. But when you see a trace of a gesture, and you've been pulled into this quiet space to really be able to notice it, I mean, I think that's the sensory experience. Is that answered?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, David.
I just have a thought of, I wonder if Tuttle's art would be, and this scenario would definitely take away some of its artistic value, but presenting it in a different way. If he had a room filled with paintings of his own or different forms of art, but none of them were titled, none of them were showing that that was a piece of art, but rather the scrape on the wall, and that had a title, or the socket, or the coat hanger, and the very small things around the room were the ones that were actually featured as the art, whereas everything else was just.
So it's present, but it's to be ignored or something.
Yeah, I wonder if almost that would make an even greater statement of here's what most people see, but can you see the beauty of what's ignored?
That would definitely be a kind of a Zen achievement of sorts. I mean, he is somebody that has a sort of background in Zen. I mean, he's very interested in kind of pulling his. I don't know that it would have the same meditative effect.
No.
To be distracted.
It wouldn't have the quiet effect, but it would have a much more of a punching face.
No, that's right. He's very careful not. Tuttle's never going to punch you in the face.
No.
I mean, and that's why I'd say. I mean, the revolting. The claim that it's kind of revolting is fascinating. Usually, we might be revolted at the idea that this guy's a job doing this. I mean, fair enough, right? I mean, it's a privilege of sorts, right? But the works themselves aren't as in our face. I mean, there are other people, Andre Serrano, who's, done sculptures out of human feces, taken photographs of them, and done the whole exhibit of that. That's in your face, right? I mean, there's no more, okay, it's done, okay? You win, game over, right? You can't get, Tuttle's not like that. So I'd say Tuttle's not about punch at all, right? And he never labels his work. When you go into one of his exhibits, nothing's labeled. I mean, you're just so, I think so, in some ways, but it's an interesting suggestion, I think. What would it be like to see one of Tuttle's pieces on its own in exhibit? Might be another way to ask your question, right? This was a retrospective that we saw. If you go to the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, you can see one of the octagonal pieces he did on its own. It's easy to just blitz right by that guy. I mean, I think there's something about installation art for him that's important. So I don't know that helps a little bit about the kinds of installations that he would use. Yes, I'll start in the back and then I'll work for it.
I was wondering, do you think that with
Tuttle, yeah.
Tuttle, do you think that with his autonomy, do you think that lies more in the fact of minimalism or in the fact of the traces or the objects he uses? And I'm thinking, I went to a convention I went to very similar, and there was an art display of this giant hairball and this random wire thing, and in the middle there was contraption with wires, and it had a string off, the wires angled up with a string, and there was a plastic fork, and it spun around in a circle. And so you get to this thing, and it's
What's going on?
Tunnels work, and so that's why I asked.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, a fork would, once again, it'd be too much of an object. I mean, all of his things are very rarely, sort of recognizable, like as a found object.
This has so much going on, that's why I say the minimalism versus this choice of objects.
I think it's really hard to divorce Tuttle from his minimalism. But I think in art history, there are a lot of minimalists. I mean, you have Malevich or other supremacists, right? And they have very confrontational, and it's just, the white canvas, but it's very much in your face. Other minimalists like Frank Stella, I mean, a lot of the people that Cy Twombly was responding to was kind of the severity of the constraints of a super minimalism. When you get to Tuttle's work, what's odd about them is, while they're incredibly minimal, they're the most gentle things you've ever seen, where they're very, very different from. And you can have a Frank Stella next to it, which you might think descriptively, or even in a book, is very, very similar. It's just, a brown square, right? But it has to do with sort of the marks, the cuttings. I mean, there's something about Tuttle's work that I think, it's not just the minimalism, but the way in which the minimalism draws us down to what, and it just keeps getting simpler and simpler. As I say, I mean, the rope that's just tufted a little bit at the end. I mean, you might say, there's something about the tiny, the smallest little whisper that's distinctively human has a really big impact. It's very different from something. I mean, people. I mean, you go to works that are sort of installation pieces with found objects, the fork or wheelbarrow with light bulbs or whatever it is. People are always kind of they're all kind of, that's not what you see in a Tuttle exhibit. I mean, some people will walk in and just turn right around. I mean, they'll say what the heck, and they'll leave. But you don't see as much sort of snickering and so on. I don't know. Tuttle never strikes me as. I mean, there are artists that seem like they're in your face. I mean, they're almost like Oscar Wilde in the sense of their personas. I mean, someone like Andy Warhol, who so he's gonna Warhol strikes me as close to someone. Warhol always made fun of himself. I mean, he had one patron who wanted to buy one of his silk screens of a car wreck, and he offered him $200,000. He said, "I got a great idea for you. Let's get you 200,000 $1 bills. We'll put them in a big glass case and put them on your wall." Right? I mean, that just that's a classic sort of Warhol sort of self-parody. Tuttle's work is totally different. I mean, and once again, maybe, and I hate as a philosopher to say, you gotta see it. You know what I'm saying? Because I want to make an argument about it. Did that answer your concern? Address it. It's hard. I mean, the minimalism is a clear amplifier.
Yeah, I guess I was wondering if as far as the autonomy component of that, if that was more related to the human traces, or is it something else?
I mean, I think my argument was, in my experience of the exhibit, and what other people have pointed out, is that the simplification works as an amplifier until you get the subtlest, smallest gesture that still is distinctively human. And when you see it in that small space, and you've been meditatively through the exhibit kind of brought into that space, it's this thundering presence of sorts. And it's really affecting. And I think, so it's really hard to divorce it from the, from the minimalism. Now, as I say, I mean, lots of people are going to have different responses to Tuttle's work, but I think that's where I would say the minimalism is essential to it. And it makes it feel, it's very familiar. You don't get, it's comfortable. I mean, in a sense, Tuttle is just the least abrasive, unassuming artist you can imagine. He's the last person to get up in your face. I mean, that's why I kind of show the picture, just him standing out in the desert. I think he'd be okay. Yes?
I was going to ask, by choosing those two artists and their works, does that give you a more powerful argument than, picking something more scripture or less minimalism?
Yes. That was precisely what I wanted to do. Find harmony.
Being able to pick out beauty from, the most, the hardest thing to find beauty in.
That's right. And quite frankly, two artists that I did not care for at all. I mean, the last Socratic Club paper I gave, I said, why is there no beauty in art? I mean, that was kind of, why have we rejected beauty in all these areas? And I said, look at this Twombly guy. I used him as a joke, right? And so, but of course, it's sort of my honesty, my kind of myself, and I think, there's something in me that maybe, I don't know, maybe I just have, I thought, I can't make a joke of somebody that really made a huge impact in the art world. So I thought, I've got to go and spend time with it. So the next time I was in Philly, actually, just a couple weeks later, I was like, I'm going to try to figure this out. Peter.
This is actually for Dr.
Great.
You talked about Oscar Wilde, kind of how he painted his persona of himself, kind of became an art for himself to work on. And I know in Dorian Gray there's a line where Lord Henry tells Dorian Gray that he's become his greatest artwork. But then going back to the preface to Dorian Gray, that no artwork can be moral. I kind of wonder what that means for creating an identity. If it really is just making art, is the morality of your self-identity dropped out then?
I think that he suggests it. I'm not sure that the novel bears it out. Does that make sense? I think the more you read of Oscar Wilde, the more you read contradiction in what he says. He's very inconsistent. So I think going into the novel, that would be my expectation. But by the end of the novel, all of the sins are evident, right? I mean, all of the immorality that Dorian engages in has to be displayed somewhere, and so it ends up on the painting. But I'm not sure that we can then read this as well written or badly written without a trace of moral intent in it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
I have a closely related question, and it really has to do with putting your two presentations more closely in conversation. According to Erik's argument, we see in Tuttle and Twombly art that has the effect, or at least it can have, I'll use the word that you put there, the way that you articulated it. It can have the effect of drawing us into an experience where we recognize an other. And I think the way you sketched out Dorian Gray suggests that the novel can do precisely that, even in the episodes that you talked to us about, because there we see aesthetically displayed a person whose allegiance to an ideal conception of art leads him to fail to even see the humanity of the person that he's engaged with.
Right.
So, would you say that you think? I mean, and it goes directly to this question about whether you think, despite what Wilde tells us, that the novel turns out to be deeply moral in that precise sense.
I think that it does, and it could be that I'm missing something grand in his scheme, because he says explicitly that it's not necessarily that. But I think that he means more that it doesn't need to be that. And so if the moral is well written, if the moral is ancillary to the aesthetic value of the book, I think that it's, I don't want to say excusable, it's justified for him, right? That he can give us this basically fairly straightforward moral message in the text at the same time as he insists on beauty, right? This character who insists on beauty, though, ends up fairly unattractive in a lot of ways. Yeah.
This isn't really a question as much as it makes me think, it makes me beg the question, if it's possible to become a work of art, as Dorian Gray wishes to be, and is, does becoming art and stripping yourself of such things that define you as human, morality, values, all things that give a black and white or any kind of ruling and boundaries in life, if you become art, does that really make you ascend humanity in general? Do you become more than human by losing everything that makes you human? Or does it make you subhuman, that you've lost everything that humanity is defined by? That's sort of the question that makes that like reading it makes me think about it.
I'll start and you can jump in. You can save me.
It doesn't need to be answered.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good question. And I think it's interestingly posed in the book by someone who was self-conscious about his own production, right? That saw himself consistently as produced. I think it ends up part of the tragedy for Wilde as well as for Dorian Gray that he was so drawn to the ability that he could manipulate, that performance could outlive somehow his actual self. And he printed up cards that introduced himself as professor of aesthetics. All right, because he put it on a card, that makes it so. But I think too that he really had the sense that he could defend himself in his court trials with fiction, with a pose, and it went ill for him.
But one of the things that happens throughout, I mean, from a philosopher's perspective, one of the things that you notice in the picture of Dorian Gray is the way in which it plays, and many of the phrases that come out, the language itself makes a direct appeal to this 18th century notion of a beautiful soul. There is the rise in the 18th century of this notion of beauty as a moral attribute, or you might say a discussion of the ways in which many of our moral categories of evaluating people seem to have a deep aesthetic dimension to them. we say that people are flawed, people are disgusting. I mean, think of anything somebody might say about somebody that's morally corrupt, and many of the terms have an aesthetic flavor or character to them. Now, in the 18th century, that was really a focus on the inner soul. In the 19th century, there's a way in which some philosophers, some thinkers believe that that was perverted into this notion that outward beauty must be an indicator of a beautiful soul. And I've often thought, reading... It's precisely right, that's right, exactly. And this happens all the time. Think of the
It's
gold.
linked to a recovery of classicism, too, the whole idea.
That's right. And so there's a lot of Dorian Gray, which I think he's playing just on that. The whole book is suffused with this notion of which is the soul, which is the appearance. And he switches them. I mean, I think it's this fascinating question that I think he leaves intentionally ambiguous at the end. I know if I were an English professor, I'm not probably, but I would ask my students this question. Did the knife ever pierce the canvas? What happened in that final scene upstairs? If you're a philosopher, you might start to say the painting, the work of art actually becomes a definite descriptor. It actually starts tracking something very different, and it was just a pure suicide. It's left completely ambiguous what's seen in that attic, right? But that's playing directly off of this notion of the inner soul, the outer soul, beauty in both worlds, and I think there was this weird perversion of this notion of a beautiful soul that I think frustrated the heck out of Wilde. And I can imagine how creating a persona is in the same way piercing a hole in that, just as, and this is to go out on a huge limb, especially here, Lady Gaga is doing something similar with femininity, I think. I mean, I'm not going to go too far down that path. But I think, no, this creation of a persona is often playing precisely with that. With these strong dynamics of inner essence versus outward appearance and the relationship between the two, and the qualities of character and the terms of description and evaluation that we think are most appropriate for one, but then get metaphorically appropriated to the other. And I see that throughout all this, and I think, does that make sense? I don't know if it's...
Yeah, absolutely.
But I don't know enough about Wilde, but listening to you, that's just what I started the thing. So do you think that the knife ever pierced the canvas?
I think it's an interesting question.
And look at the descriptors of the sounds that are made, whether the sounds would be a body or painting. Anyway, I'm just small. I'm
You're a literature professor.
See, it's so easy to just get all excited.
Maybe one more question, Dan.
Well, I know we're just about out of time, but Dr. Cunningham, you left me tantalized that this isn't going to be your... I'm looking for this synthesis between the representative of Eros, the representative of Agape, and all I see so far is karma, right? I think you did an unbelievable job at the beginning. I thought, what is going on the screen? I saw individuality. This is the mark of the individual. I saw the trace of the autonomy of this flesh.
That's right.
But I don't see why I'm attracted to it. What distinguishes your response to that painting from malice?
Right.
I see an individual. Why not kill it? What makes you? You said beauty. You said you're pulled to this kind of beautiful experience. What's the attraction? Where does that come from?
Well, I mean, I think the attraction just is a sensory experience of these basic sources of our worth as people, and what pulls us, what requires us in some ways, ethically, to extend our attention and care and concern to other people. I mean, so that's what's pulling us, I think.
Well, that's completely non-essential, isn't it? I mean, you're recognizing
But
the
I'm
autonomy
arguing
that can never appear. The autonomy can never show up.
Right, it can't. And that's why I think it's so important that Tuttle is absent from the room. I mean, I think this notion of walking around just this post-apocalyptic landscape is a kind of a sensory experience that kind of leaves you. It's a trace of the time. I think if you were present, if you were like Twombly and you were there in the room, I think it'd be very distracting. Even if you were there present to his artwork, if that makes sense. But that's what, for me, it's all sensory. Now, Dan, there's no way that I can convince them. I mean, that's one of the things that I say at the beginning. I mean, doing this sort of work on artists like that is tricky because I can't, I mean, David Hume often says, look, art, if you want to talk about beauty, you can talk about natural beauty or you can talk about beauty in art. And Hume, in his discussions of taste, says, I'm not going to talk about nature because you can't do anything but just point, as he says, right? If somebody doesn't find the Grand Canyon, take them there, and if your kids are like, right? There's nothing you can do. But he says there's something you can say if you're confronting an artwork because of the way it's intentionally put together and so on. And I think that's true about art. Now, that doesn't mean I can ever offer somebody an argument and say, here, I'm gonna, it's not persuasion in that sense. It's rather a kind of a reportage, I guess you could say, of how that sensory experience. But I think for me, it was this distinct experience. I remember coming out just thinking, wow, I've never felt such, and I want to say, this is the kind of the blending of the play. I've never felt such an erotic attraction toward other people's autonomy. Everybody on the streets. Yes.
Do you think that happened because it was an act of charity on your part to even see something in the art that you were not initially attracted to?
No doubt at all. No
So
doubt at all.
There's the agape, because
That's right.
you can easily be attracted to a very beautiful, kind soul, whatever. They physically may not be, but if it's in them, you will. But if they're not, you will be repelled.
That's right. And that's why I began by saying, what I was taught by my Sunday school teacher was misleading in the art world. If I start with these are unlovable works of art, I'm not going to position myself relative to them to be open to them. And that's why I came away from my paper where I called Scientology a joke, and I realized that's just, I must be missing something. So you did have to go and be open to canvas. And I would say in the Scientology case, it was difficult. It's in your face. The shield and it's graffiti. It's like sitting there. There was a time I was sitting there. I keep a little notebook where I just kind of, keep track. And I was like, I feel like I'm just sitting on the can, right, looking at the wall of a men's room, right? That's how it looked. And it's hard to keep there, but then eventually it unfolds. So I would agree with you. I think agape builds on agape, but this is my Platonist in me. I want to say it's sensual. That love is deeply erotic. And I can't convince somebody else that it is, but I think you're missing something of the agape if you're not motivated by the sensual presence of another person. And I can't think of anything but art that helps us, in my experience, that seems to help us so well.